quote from John Kennedy, comes back to me, tempered by war and a hard and bitter peace. That's a generation that's been tempered by this war, which is the toughest war Israel's ever had to fight. This is World War II kind of fighting.
Did Israel's political and military leadership fail on October 7th? The events of that day have had a huge impact on Israel, and they've shaped her decisions moving forward. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside the Epicenter with Joel Rosenberg, a podcast of the Joshua Fund, a ministry dedicated to blessing Israel and her neighbors in the name of Jesus. I'm Lynn Rosenberg with the Joshua Fund, and today we present Joel's interview with Dan Gordon about the impact of the October 7th attack on the country of Israel and what they have to do to move forward.
I've heard a lot of Israelis say that October 7th was the day that has changed Israel forever. In some ways, it's early to know exactly how, but I'm curious, based on all the reporting you've been doing for the last 4 months or so, plus your own life experience and instincts, and what are some of the ways that you think Israel is or is going to be changed forever?
We had certain illusions that we bought into, that we wanted to believe. In the documentary, I actually quoted a eulogy that was given by Moshe Dayan.
Famous Israeli general, the eye patch, iconic leader.
He was, this was in 1956, he was the chief of staff. 1956 is, math isn't my strong suit, but it's still more than a decade before the 67 war, before there were any occupied territories, before there were any settlements, before there were any settlers, before there were any of the so-called root causes of the conflict between us. And he gave this eulogy in a place called Nahal Oz, which was the same kibbutz that Noam Tibon had to go to save his children from terrorists from Gaza. It was the first place in my life I was ever shot at, 1963, which is still before there were any territories, before there
wasn't even the
settlements.
PLO. Yeah, there certainly wasn't Hamas for another 25 years.
At that time, the terrorists called themselves Fedayeen. And I was shot at for the crime of planting palm trees. I was out with another kid planting palm trees in Nahal Oz. In 1956, there was a 21-year-old kid named Rosenberg who was brutally murdered in Nahal Oz. Shot, beaten, shot again, his body dragged into Gaza. Finally, they returned his body. And Moshe Dayan gave a eulogy in which he said, how could we have been so blind as to not see the brutality of our fate, which is we have got to be strong and armed and prepared because we live surrounded by a sea of hatred of people who are waiting for the day that we get weak enough so that their hand can attain our blood. That's the literal translation of what he said. And he said, we have to not be deceived by illusions, lest the sword fall from our hand and our lives be cut short.
Almost prophetic.
Totally prophetic. So when you say, how has Israel changed? We forgot where we lived. We forgot we lived in the Middle East. We don't live next to Switzerland. We don't live next to Denmark. We don't live next to Kansas. Life would be very simple if we lived next to any of those places. We live in the Middle East. We live in the toughest neighborhood in the world. We do live surrounded by certain people, not all of them, but certainly in Gaza, certainly many in Judea and Samaria, who wish to attain our blood, to quote Dayan. And we have a responsibility to ourselves, to our children, to our grandchildren, to remain strong and remain vigilant, and to still look for a way to live in peace with our neighbors, to not give up on that.
So in a practical way, how do you see that changing Israel? Meaning, politically, for example.
We now remember where we live.
Because we had just signed the Abraham Accords, we had United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco, Kosovo also, though not Arab. And we were inbound. The biggest peace treaty of all, which was Saudi-Israeli, that was the ethos here on October 6th, which is, this is close.
Which I think will survive this.
I think so too.
I think it's in their, I've talked with Saudis, I've talked with Emiratis. It's in their interest. They very much want us to defeat Hamas. They can't say it publicly. They are counting on us defeating Hamas and then proceeding with that treaty. But we don't have the luxury of having the illusion that we can live next to an existential evil that wants us dead. And that says very proudly, we thought we could contain them. We thought they were somehow different than ISIS. They were the devil we knew. And we even got to a sick place. It's almost like an abused spouse of saying, well, we'll have to have a war every 4 or 5 years. It won't be a big war. We've got Iron Dome now, which knocks down the rockets. Not a lot of us will be killed. And we can
manage this.
Yeah, we can.
It's not a problem to solve. It's a tension to be managed.
Yeah, and those were the terms that were used. It was a manageable problem. It's not a manageable problem.
This is a country that started as a left-wing socialist enterprise. Most people who founded the state didn't believe in God or weren't sure what they believed, but it wasn't a religious group. It was, which was, for me as an evangelical Jewish person, is fascinating that God was fulfilling prophecies through people who didn't believe that he existed, much less that the Bible was true, much less the prophecies were legitimate or real. That's interesting. But there was also a wonderful, as part of that, there was an ethos that, look, we had to fight and win, but now our hands are open and we want to make peace with our neighbors. And over the last 75 years, there is almost not a left-wing left, because terror attack, war after terrorist attack has kept moving the population from left to center right to right. Now, I mean, there are far right, lunatics, but basically we are now a center-right country, and not because there was some great political campaign to persuade. It's just the evidence of who are we dealing with. So that's interesting to me, that there's almost not a left-wing left. I can't even think of another country in the world that moved from totally left to center-right with almost no left. So that's one thing but now the question is not that as having changed it, that's just part of it. But now is the Mr. Security, the man Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has served longer as a prime minister than anybody else, more than Ben-Gurion, he was blindsided. I mean, one would have argued that if somebody got the threat that we face, he would get it and make sure that we were all safe, right? There was the famous commercial when I don't even remember who he was running up against at the time, but it was the babysitter, that he would knock on the door and he was the babysitter. Like, you don't want a novice to come in. If you elect Bibi Netanyahu, you'll be safe. Now, I'm not trying to make a political point. I'm just saying, in all your reporting, how do you see his future, the future of the IDF leadership at the top, and the intelligence leadership? Because I think that's one of the elements that strikes me as going to be changed dramatically. But
yeah, I think everybody bought into what they called the concept, and it's the same as someone who lived through the Yom Kippur War. It's the exact same failure that we had in the Yom Kippur War. There was a concept that Egypt wouldn't attack without air superiority. There was a concept that Hamas actually wanted to improve the lives of their people, wasn't interested in a major war, was shifting from a religious Islamo-fascist group to somehow a governing authority, and that we could manage the situation. My personal, just me, Yossi six-pack. Everybody at the top, and I think most Israelis feel this way, has to go. In the political echelon, in the military echelon, in the intelligence echelon, they all failed. They all bought into the concept. And there are people who were chiefs of staff before the current, and the current chief of staff is a wonderful soldier. I know him a little bit. He's a great soldier. He's a good man. He bought into the concept. He's taken responsibility and said, I failed. The intelligence, you can't boot everybody out during this war. This war has to end. Then there have to be committees of inquiry. But that entire group, I believe, needs to go. And I think you're going to find a generation of younger guys who've served in reserves in this war, who have the quote from John Kennedy, comes back to me, tempered by war and a hard and bitter peace. That's a generation that's been tempered by this war, which is the toughest war Israel's ever had to fight. This is World War II kind of fighting. This is what the Marines
House
were
to
up
house,
against.
apartment to apartment.
This is what the Marines were
neighborhood
up
to neighborhood,
against.
alley to alley,
yeah.
and now tunnels, or it would have been at the time, it would have been trenches, but this is trench warfare.
You've just been in Gaza. I was just in Gaza a couple of weeks ago. This is the most difficult urban warfare environment in the history of warfare, outside of the Japanese fortified islands. Those
Trying
are your two.
to fight underground and above ground and coordinate those maneuvers is extremely difficult.
And then you mix in with that with something the Marines didn't have to deal with until they got to Okinawa. And then they really did. I mean, the parallels between Okinawa and Gaza are really big. You had a huge civilian population. People forget that in the Battle of Okinawa, 100,000 Japanese civilians were killed. 100,000. Because urban warfare, when the terrorist embeds himself in with the civilian population, is a dirty, messy, horrible business. Israel is actually performing in terms of civilian casualties better than any other army in modern warfare. You have less, and every civilian death is horrible.
Of course.
But the truth is, you have less than 2-to-1 civilians being killed in ratio to combatants, less than 2-to-1. When America was in Mosul, we were fighting against ISIS with 86 other countries in our coalition, against a monster that 86 countries said have to be taken out. Intelligence estimate from the Kurdish intelligence, which was the best there were, 40,000 civilians were killed in Mosul. 40,000 civilians were killed in Mosul. Usually you were talking about a ratio of 4-to-1 civilians to combatants killed. What's going on right now in Gaza, and the worst of it, was less than 2-to-1. And those casualties on civilians' part have been cut in half over the last 2 weeks, which no one's reporting.
Yeah.
Absolutely no one's reporting that. So Israel has done an extraordinary job in trying to minimize civilian casualties, which has, again, been twisted. We warn people to leave an area in which we're going to be fighting, and then we're said to be forcibly causing their evacuation. Yeah, we forcibly cause the evacuation of our own citizens from the same place for the same reason, so they won't get killed. We've got 250,000 internally displaced Israelis right now because we forcibly removed them from the area of the battlefield.
Today's verse of the day is from Psalm 23, verse 4. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Would you join us in prayer for political and military leaders in Israel and the Epicenter, that they will all have wisdom required to stand for what's right during these crucial times and make wise decisions? Pray for all the people of Israel and all the families affected by the events of October 7th on all sides of the border.
You also mentioned that there's going to be a political earthquake, or let's say a tsunami that's going to wash all or most of the political leadership that we've ever heard of out to sea.
Yeah.
Do you see a sign that there'll be a spiritual change? And I'm not even sure exactly how to ask that or how you would see it, but I have been struck, let's just say, as an Israeli, as a Jew, as an evangelical, how little there has been a national call to prayer, to fasting. There's been a wonderful, every sign says, bring them back and together we will win. Well, I believe both those things, but you do not see billboards, posters, national leaders saying, oh Lord, if you're not with us, no matter how good we are, we can't win. Jehoshaphat, when he was the king and he saw the whole East coming, he turned to the Lord and he said, Lord, we can't do this by ourselves. And he called the whole nation to prayer. And we see that all throughout the scriptures. We really haven't seen that. And coming from an American culture, even if you don't have a particularly pious or devout president or Congress, you'll still see people calling the nation on 9/11 and so forth to prayer and to fasting and asking God's help. That's a surprise to me. And I wonder if there will be a change. I'm not sure how you see that.
I think there already has been. And Israel's much different than the United States in terms of public religion. where in the United States, there's national prayer breakfast, and there always has been, and politicians invoke God's help less so today than they used to.
Right.
But certainly, if you go back to FDR's speech on December 7th, he's invoking God. Yeah. That isn't something that has been done in Israel from a political point of view, and I think it's part of the heritage that you mentioned, that we started off with leaders who were primarily socialist,
atheist
agnostics who didn't feel comfortable promoting religion from the public arena. But I'll tell you where you see it right now. You see it amongst families. You see it absolutely amongst the soldiers in the field. You will see, I don't care any unit you're in, Shabbat comes, everybody wants the blessing, everybody wants to participate in it. There's nobody who says, I'm going to...
No atheist in a foxhole.
Not only not atheist in a foxhole, but there's really we had a big divide in this country between religious and secular people. That divide doesn't exist in the Army. It doesn't exist in the reserves. You've got guys who are ultra-Orthodox, not just wear kippah, but they have the forelocks and the beards and the full tilt, with guys who are seemingly atheist, arms around each other, asking God's blessing on the Shabbat. I remember one thing that was so moving to me. We were talking about this was your first ride in an armored personnel carrier. Was in an armored personnel carrier going with combat engineers to blow up some rocket launchers. And the guy who was the driver of the APC was an Orthodox guy. And he turned to the commander of the APC and said, time for me to pray. Now, we're in an area where there are bullets whizzing around. And we had just encountered terrorists who were laying an ambush for us when we came to blow up this particular tunnel. He popped the hatch, he took his prayer book, he said the evening prayers, and the guy who was the commander, who was not religious at all, turned to us to make sure we would be quiet to honor his prayer. And when the guy came down from praying, grabbed his hand, put his arm around him, and knew he was praying for him.
And you see that as a change.
I absolutely do, and I see.
You would know. You've been here
as an embracing
all these years,
and an embracing of God. And who are you going to turn to in a time of trouble? You're going to turn to God.
Dan Gordon, thank you for this interview. Thank you for making this series of documentary films for TBN and our audience. I pray that they will be used beyond TBN, that they are shown in schools, that they're shown in universities, that there's a life beyond this, that it's not just this spring, you're going to take us into the horror, the heroes, the hysteria and history, and then the hope just for our network, but that God would use, and that you would have a sense of a vision of where else this could be. If a pamphlet by Herzl changed the world, starting with connecting with an evangelical who said, how can I help? Matt is one of those evangelicals. I'm one of those evangelicals. How can we help? I pray that this film series would be enormously powerful because nobody else is doing it and nobody else cares as much to hear it and to understand than evangelicals who totally believe, even if they're not well-versed in the history of Israel. They know the biblical history and they know that you're right when you say God's in charge, and this is shaking Israel for something. It's shaking up this society at every level, religious, cultural, spiritual, political, military, intelligence, to something new.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode about the profound impact of the events of October 7th. If you have found this podcast valuable, please be in touch with us. Let us know who you are. Are you someone who's searching for Jesus? We would love to talk to you about that. Do you have any question that you'd love Joel to answer in future podcasts? Please send comments that you might have to podcast@joshuafund.net. Your feedback is incredibly valuable to us as we develop this podcast. And as always, you can check out our show notes for anything you heard on this episode that you'd like more information on. For the Joshua Fund Ministry team, I'm Lynn Rosenberg, and thank you for listening to this episode of Inside the Epicenter.
I'm Joel Rosenberg. On your left, you'll find some videos we've chosen specifically for you. We look forward to partnering with you to bless Israel and her neighbors in the name of Jesus.